Many ancient civilizations have influenced and inspired people in the 21st century, like the Greeks and the Romans, but of all the world's civilizations, none have intrigued people more than the Mayans, whose culture, astronomy, language, and mysterious disappearance all continue to captivate people. At the heart of the fascination is Chichen Itza, the most visited Mayan site. But Chichen Itza's prominence lasted for less than 200 years and was eventually succeeded by Mayapan, which lasted as the capital of Maya for nearly 225 years until the middle of the 15th century. The Mayans are still remembered and celebrated for their culture and their contributions to astronomy, language, and sports, and many of their advancements came with Mayapan as their capital. Early Mayapan was closely connected to the overshadowing power of the region at the time, the mighty trading city of Chichen Itza. Mayapan emerged first as a minor settlement in the orbit of Chichen, but it slowly came to replace it after the larger city's trade connections with the Toltecs of Tula crumbled and it suffered a staggering defeat by Mayapan's armies. The building styles and art in their city show both admiring references to the great Chichen Itza, as well as an attempt to position Mayapan as a more orthodox heir of Mayan tradition. At the same time, they emulated many features and could not escape the tremendous influences, especially in religion, of Chichen. This is seen in the fact that many of the most important buildings in the new city appear to be small-scale reproductions of ones in Chichen. Due in part to the fact that it has long been overshadowed by Chichen Itza, a lot of excavation and scholarly research on the site has only come about in recent decades, and even though there is still plenty of work to do, a lot of information about life in Mayapan has been unearthed. At its height, Mayapan may have boasted a population of over 15,000, and archaeologists have had their hands full trying to discover and restore the several thousand buildings both inside Mayapan's walls and outside them as well. Mayapan, the history of the Mayan capital, covers the history of the city, as well as the speculation and debate over the city's buildings. A note on the periods of Mayan history. There is a great dividing line in Mayan history called the Classic or Post-Classic period. Though there are other periods, including the Pre-Classic and Colonial, they don't affect the history of Mayapan much. The apogee of Mayan culture and influence was in the period known to Mesoamerican scholars as the Classical period, ranging from the 3rd to 9th centuries. During this time, the region was dominated by two great powers, Tikal and Calakmul, located far to the south of the Yucatan in the northern highlands. To the west, central Mexico was dominated by the cities of Teotihuacan, Cholula, and Monte Alban. This was a period of relative stability, though it probably didn't feel that way as the ruling dynasties of Tikal and Calakmul vied for power and fought numerous proxy wars through their many client states. This period is comparable to the Great Cold War between Athens and Sparta in ancient Greece. Much like the Roman Empire did not collapse in every area at the same time, the change from the Classic to Post-Classic occurred in different places differentially. The classic Mayan world included a constellation of city-states arranged in great, rival, shifting confederacies. These cities, including the famous centers of Tikal, Palenque, Caracol, and Calakmul, were ruled by kings who were considered semi-divine and were widely commemorated in stone monuments. Eventually, however, the great cities of the Classic period collapsed, one by one. The reasons for that collapse are not central to the story of Mayapan, but what is important is that Mayan culture did not vanish with these cities. It continued, especially in rural areas, and over time, a new series of cities emerged. While the greatest classic cities were based in the highlands of modern Mexico and Guatemala, the post-classic cities, including Chichen Itza and Mayapan, emerged in the north in the Yucatan Peninsula. Generally speaking, the post-classic period lasted from the 900s until the arrival of the Spanish in the 1500s. The history of Mayapan and all of the post-classic Yucatan Peninsula is inseparable from the conflict between three mighty families, the Itza, the Zhou, and the Kokam. Amazingly, this dynastic conflict transcended the history of any one city. They fought over Chichen Itza, and when that city fell, they fought over Mayapan. This adversarial history continued even into the Spanish colonial period, when the conquistadors allied themselves with the Zhou. At the beginning of the post-classic period, there was undoubtedly one dominant group on the Yucatan Peninsula, the Itzais. The exact origins of this group are a bit hazy, but folklore claimed that they came from the west and founded the city of Chichen Itza, mouth of the well of the Itzais. What is clear is that, unlike their contemporaries in Uxmal, they took a radically different political and economic route. Instead of placing their bets on a classic-style dynasty and economic power through land-based conquests, the Itzais emphasized an old Puuc system of governance through council and built an economic network based upon long-distance sea-based trade with what is today central Mexico. During the economic and agricultural downturn at the end of the Classic period, the Itzais traded their way through the problems and emerged as the only significant power in the region. These trade routes to Mexico, specifically to the Toltecs of the city of Tula, eventually came to be important in ways that went far beyond trade. Archaeologists have debated for some time whether Chichen Itza was conquered by the Toltecs or simply designed to emulate the Toltecs, because while the language of the city always remained a dialect of Mayan, in so many other ways elite life in cosmopolitan Chichen Itza came to resemble Tula more than a Mayan city. In the 9th century, art, style, military, architecture, governance, and, especially, religion all came to resemble reflections of the faraway Toltecs. It was in religion that the Itzais had perhaps their greatest influence by bringing a Toltec god called Quetzalcoatl to the Yucatan. He was the sovereign plumed serpent and was a messianic savior figure. In the Yucatan, Quetzalcoatl was renamed Kukulkan, which, like Quetzalcoatl, means plumed serpent. And the greatest pyramid at Chichen, now known as El Castillo, was dedicated to his worship. This was perhaps Chichen's greatest export, as Kukulkan became a central figure in Mayan religion throughout both the Yucatan and the highlands. During this period, Chichen Itza was probably viewed by its neighbors as a cosmopolitan center, a place where one might encounter people from strange cities across the seas, from the legendary deserts of the far north, from the fallen mountain kingdoms of the southern Maya, or the strange jungles of the deep south. With the possible exception of the great Toltec city of Tula to the north, there was, for the Mesoamericans, no place on earth quite on par with Chichen Itza." End quote. However, this power was not to last. In 1179 AD, Tula fell to enemies from the north, and its associated port, El Tajin, fell soon after. This left the Itzais without their trade routes or their most powerful allies. In the shadow of the great metropolis, it appears that bitterness had been growing for some time. The smaller cities and towns, built in the old Puuc style, were ripe for a revolt in the name of patriotism, and in 1221 they found their leader and their spark in the form of Hunac Seal, the founder of the Kakam dynasty. The Kakam were originally the dominant of the two lineages in the post-Chichen landscape, and went on to become the founders of Mayapan. The family was founded by Hunac Seal Sauch, an ethnic Mayan general who conquered the city of Chichen Itza, which at the time was ruled by a council of leaders who were either foreign Toltecs from central Mexico or deeply influenced by their culture. Oral histories of the region explain that in 1221 AD, there was a rebellion amongst the city's satellite states tied to the theft of the wife of one of Chichen's rulers by a powerful outside lord under whom Hunac Seal served. In the ensuing conflict, Hunac Seal was captured and eventually sacrificed to the god Cheak by being thrown into a cenote outside the city. But he survived in the cold waters all night and emerged the next day claiming to have a prophecy from Cheak himself. When his prophecy came true the following year, he was appointed by Chichen Itza's rulers to become the ruler of Mayapan, which was at that point a tribute city of Chichen Itza officially under the power of Ah Mex Cook, Chichen's titular ruler. If Ahmek Kuk and the Itzaes, as the elites of the city were called, hoped that this would serve to remove him from an influential role over their city's politics, they were grossly mistaken. Using Mayapan as a base, Hunak Seal forged an alliance with Uxmal, another important Chichen Itza tribute city, and conquered the great capital. With this stunning victory, he broke the chokehold of the Itzaes Council over local politics and established Mayapan as the capital of a new confederation, including Mayapan, Uxmal, and Chichen Itza, sans the Ahmek Kuk and Itzaes councilors. Recent archaeology shows that a settlement had previously existed at the location of Mayapan, which makes sense because its water sources would have allowed for agriculture. But the previous settlement was not a significant city, and certainly not a walled city or a capital before this time. The remnants of the Itzaes would flee the Yucatan altogether, retreating to Lake Pitan Itza in the highlands of Guatemala, where their leaders would found another city called Tayasal that would be the last Mayan city to fall to the Spaniards. At the same time, the political entity that emerged in the Yucatan, called the League of Mayapan, owed its structure to the political council of Chichen Itza. The system was called Multipel, joint rule. This relative equality between city-states in the League allowed for a structure to the Kokam-Zhu rivalry. While the traditional texts, particularly the Chilam Balam manuscript, describe both Ahmek Kuk and Hunak Seal as Itzaes, the ruling ethnic group of Chichen Itza, it is tempting to see the conquest of Hunak Seal as an example of an anti-foreigner indigenous uprising. The cities and towns that allied with Hunak Seal, except for Uxmal, were all located around the Puuc Hills, a low mountain range in the Yucatan's northwest that had been a center for political and artistic power before the rise of Chichen Itza. Moreover, one of the most notable cultural elements of Chichen Itza in the Mayan landscape was its cosmopolitan character, so it certainly would have been associated with foreign ideas and foreign power during its time, perhaps even seen as an imperial intrusion on the landscape. Hunak Seal's conquest of the city and his transfer of political and military power to Mayapan and its Puuc allies may have been seen as a return to traditional power structures and values. Beyond the textual evidence, there are several other areas of interest for this thesis. First is the fact that Hunak Seal replaced the Toltec-inspired ruling council of Chichen Itza with a dynastic system led by his family, the Cocomes, which was similar to pre-Chichen classic Mayan polities like Tikal, which may have been looked at as a Mayan golden age by post-classic Yucatecans. Second is the fact that in Mayapan there was a conscious revival of a pre-Chichen architectural style called the Puuc style, as well as other artistic forms like carved stones called stele, in distinctive traditional style called the Katun ending. Finally, the alliance went out of its way to recruit Uxmal, famous even today as a center of the Puuc style and the previously dominant power before Chichen. At that point, Uxmal was probably a shadow of its former glory because no major construction had occurred at the site since the rise of Chichen. At the same time, it also appears that the Cocomes were never fully confident of their own power, perhaps initially because they feared the return to power by the Itzaes at Chichen. Thus, instead of having a sprawling city like Chichen or Coba, another contemporary city to the east, they built a densely packed walled city, something that had not been seen before in the Mayan world. The Chilam Balam even refers to Mayapan as the fortress. Such an expenditure of wealth needed to construct the city's mighty walls would not have been done lightly, providing further proof of a profound, long-term anxiety on the part of the city's rulers. The Cocomes' great rivals, the Tutul-Zhu family, usually just called the Zhus, were based in the city of Mani, which was listed in Chilam Balam as one of the allied towns within Hunak Seal's original confederacy. The Zhu were originally rulers of Uxmal, which was the last flowering of the classic Mayan civilization and built upon the local base of the Puuc aesthetic. Uxmal reached its zenith under the only ruler commemorated in stone at the site, Lord Chak. Rising up between 875 and 900 AD, Chac seized the helm of Uxmal, previously governed by a council of elites, and forged it into a military power that quickly dominated its rivals. Under Chac and his immediate successors, Uxmal expanded and built impressive structures, including a central pyramid called the Temple of the Magician. The temples here were focused upon the worship of the rain god Chac. However, the era of glory was short-lived, with the great palaces and temples abandoned by 925 AD, and while it appears that the city was not completely abandoned, it was inhabited during the time of Hunaxil 300 years later, it was eventually replaced in its position of regional dominance by Chichen. When Uxmal returned to the historical record in the 1220s, during Hunaxil's rise, it was associated with a powerful noble family called the Jus. While there is not a direct textual connection between Lord Chac and the Jus, the family made a claim to the site and considered its abandoned temples to be theirs until the period of the Spanish conquest. It appears that they were forced out of the city in the 13th century, after which they founded Mani, a smaller town. Mani is still occupied today and was one of the centers for colonial power and the site of the first Franciscan mission in the region. Thus, while the Cocomes may have represented the new order founded by the charismatic and divinely inspired Hunaxil, the Jus may have represented the old order of pre-Chichen Puuc glory, based in Uxmal and tracing its history back centuries to Lord Chac, the last of the classic Mayan kings, and a towering historic figure that rivaled Hunaxil. This balance of power between the two families remained in place for a little over 2 centuries until the fall of Mayapan in 1441 AD, when the Jus finally deposed their rivals and became the most powerful family of the region. By then, the original fear of the Itza among the Cocom had probably been replaced by fear of the Jus, and the eventual conquest of the city, despite the massive walls, shows that this fear was well placed. The Jus, perhaps learning a lesson of the escape of the Itzais from the fall of Chichen, butchered the Cocoms and drove the lone survivor, who was absent during the attack, into exile, obliterating the rival line with a single stroke. The justifications for the Jus' actions were recorded by their eventual Spanish allies. Quote, "The governing Cocom began to covet riches, and to that end negotiated with the garrison kept by the kings of Mexico, the Aztecs, in Tabasco and Xicalango, that he would put the city in their charge. In this way he introduced the Mexicans into Mayapan, oppressed the poor, and made slaves of the many. This Cocom was the first who made slaves, but out of this evil came the use of arms to defend themselves, that they might not all become slaves." End quote. This explanation should be taken with the same grain of salt that any post facto justification of war needs, but it does give readers insight into what the Jus believed to be legitimate reasons for their wars. In particular, it is interesting that the chronicles repeatedly note in other sections the use of Mexican mercenaries by the Cocom to defend their position. Between the construction of walls and the importation of foreign mercenaries, it appears that the Cocom felt their precariousness long before their fall and attempted to stave off the Jus, but in the end it was all for naught. Quote, "The chiefs of other cities then attached themselves to the party of the Tutul Jus, a man patriotic like his ancestors, and they plotted to kill Cocom. This they did, killing at the same time all of his sons save one who was absent. They sacked his dwelling and possessed themselves of all his property, his stores of cacao and other fruits, saying thus that they repaid themselves what had been stolen from them." End quote. However, despite the aspiration of Jus to dominate the region, the post-Mayapan Yucatan did not become a Jus-dominated confederacy centered on Mani. Instead, it increasingly fractured into small, warring statelets until the arrival of the Spanish, who did not encounter any unified resistance in the region. In fact, the Jus, in a last attempt for dominance, quickly allied with the Spanish, even inviting the Franciscan missionaries to live in Mani. Their plans would not work, and they, like all the other indigenous elites in Mesoamerica, were eventually dispossessed and replaced by Spaniards. Timeline of events in the Yucatan post-classic period. 750 AD. Estimated foundation of Uxmal. 850 AD. Estimated beginning of the Puuc style. 455 AD. Estimated foundation of Chichen Itza. 875 to 900 AD. The reign of Lord Chac in Uxmal. 875 to 880 AD. Height of the Puuc style in Chichen Itza. End of royal power in Uxmal. 925 AD. End of the classic Mayan period. Late 900s. Chichen is the dominant power in the Yucatan. Early 1000s. Conquest of Chichen by Toltec-influenced leaders. 1100s. First small settlements at Mayapan. 1179. Estimated fall of the Toltec city of Tula. Early 1200. Estimated foundation of Mani by the Zhou. 1221. Hunac-Seal's vision. Hunac-Seal's conquest of Chichen. 1222. Foundation of Mayapan as the capital. 1441. Fall of the Cocombs and the destruction of Mayapan. 1521. Cortes stops on the Mayan coast while traveling to Mexico. 1528 to 1535. First and Second Spanish invasion. 1542. Spanish conquest of Mani and the Zhou-Spanish alliance. 1549. Last Yucatecan cities fall to the Spanish. 1562. The Great Auto de Fe in Mani, destruction of the Mayan elite culture. 1840s. Catherwood and Stephen visit Mayapan and other cities. The Maya led by the Cocombs and Itzais rise up against Mexico. 1938. First archaeological survey of Mayapan. 1996. Beginning of restoration of the Mayapan city center. Mayapan was a dense city compared to the sprawling metropolises of the classic period. Within its walls, 4,000 buildings were clustered in an area of 4.2 square kilometers, 1.5 square miles, and original estimates of over 10,000 inhabitants have been recently bumped up to a population of 15,000 to 17,000. While this may not be large for a modern settlement, it was a considerable town for the Mayan post-classic period after Chichen, and it had all the features one would expect in a power base, including walls, temples, plazas, palaces, and markets. Altogether, the layout of the city walls created an area that has a rough appearance of the outline of a pickaxe head. Using this metaphor, the blade of the pickaxe faces west and southwest, and the pick juts off to the northeast. The city center was located in the western third of the city, near the axe blade of the pickaxe. At the center of this blade was the main plaza, the location of the most important buildings, including palaces, central plazas, temples, and other ritual structures. The most important structure is the temple of the god Kukulkan, located on the south side of Central Plaza. Decorated with pillars covered in plumed serpents, it is a smaller version of the famous Castillo, also a temple to Kukulkan of Chichen Itza. On the east side of the same plaza was the second tallest pyramid, today called Crematorio or Crematorium, and across the plaza is another little brother of a famous Chichen structure, the Templo Redondo, which mimics the larger city's Caracol Celestial Observatory. This palace would have served many purposes, as it was probably officially for the populace to gather to observe important ceremonies on top of the pyramids, but since it was in the heart of the city, it would have been an important crossroads for the day-to-day traffic of commerce, governance, and socialization. Surrounding the plaza were the workshops and potentially homes of the city's many craftspeople, but immediately to the east and west of their workshops are the palaces of the most powerful families. Undoubtedly, both the Cacombe and Zhou had mansions here, And though it's tempting to place the dominant Cacombe in a particularly large palace directly to the west of the plaza and set within its own semi-agricultural fields, there's no evidence confirming this was their mini-estate within the city. The 4 or 5 remaining palaces that have been discovered are located to the east of the plaza and are surrounded by residential neighborhoods, including the smaller palaces presumably owned by lesser nobility. Historians know that the League of Mayapan Confederacy that emerged out of Hunac Seal's revolution involved a council of leaders dominated by a small number of families, and given this knowledge, many imagine each of these palaces were possibly the city homes for families with greater estates in their own city-state elsewhere in the Yucatan. It's possible that, like the great capitals of Europe, there was a courtly season when these houses were filled and the social rounds and politicking were intense, followed by a period when the families retired to their ancestral estates. To the north of this residential zone, close to the north wall and the top of the axe head, was the city's principal marketplace, a sprawling area perhaps larger than the main plaza. This market edged the main highway to the north, which in turn led to the main plaza, and from there to the south and southeast gates. Despite the density of the settlement, the interior of the walls was dotted with milpas, the local term for corn and vegetable fields. 23 agricultural fields have been found within the walls, and a further 14 in the immediate vicinity, within sight of the fortifications. These areas may have meant that the city could have withstood sieges longer by producing their own food, and they may also have served as truck gardens, providing the daily fruits and vegetables for the city's market. In addition to the grand temples at the city's heart, there were smaller temple complexes scattered throughout the grounds. For instance, recent excavations in the northeast of the city have found the Itzmal Chen ceremonial group, including a small pyramid temple and 3 priest buildings flanking a small plaza with a cenote, sinkhole well, in its center. They have also found a mass grave containing 18 elite patrons of the temple. While Mayapan attracts droves of curious tourists, the most defining feature of the city for the Maya was its defensive walls. While the name Mayapan signifies the banner of the Maya, Spanish chronicler Diego de Landa noticed that the city had another, more common name, Ichpa, within the fortifications. The importance of these walls for the city's place in the Mayan imagination is further reinforced by the Chilam Balam text, which refers to the city as the fortress. The only similarly walled town in the Yucatan was the little fortified port town of Tulum on the eastern shore, which is today immensely popular among tourists in Cancun. The walls have been estimated to be 9 kilometers, over 5.5 miles, long, 10 to 15 feet thick, and over 6 feet high, with a parapet on top. The walls were guarded by 12 gates, 7 of which were major entrances with vaulted chambers, and the gates were scattered with some regularity around the walls. 3 gates have temples just inside them, and the gates are also sometimes close to cenotes. The number and placement of the gates was probably for the ease not only of long-distance trade, but also for farmers who lived within the walls to have easy access to their fields, as well as for similar economic activities like firewood gathering and hunting. Archaeologists have found that some of these gates were blocked, so it is probable that only a portion of the gates were functioning at any given time. But it is also possible that they were blocked up in the city's final days as a way to forestall entry by the armies of the Zhou.